what does it mean to decolonize my heart and mind? And how do I go about doing that? Well, so many indigenous people have said to me that the first and most important thing that we have to do is to decolonize our hearts and minds. And part of what that means is to question every assumption that you've ever had about the way life is. You know, so many indigenous people have said to me that the most important difference between indigenous and Western ways of being is that even the most open-minded Westerners perceive listening to the natural world as a metaphor, as opposed to the way the world really is. Indigenous people around the world generally perceive the world as consisting of other beings to enter into relationship with and to whom we have responsibility, as opposed to resources for us to exploit. And that's a huge difference, because if you perceive, there's a great line by a Canadian lumberman. There's a great line by a Canadian lumberman. When I look at trees, I see dollar bills. And if when you look at trees, you see dollar bills, you're going to treat them one way. If when you look at trees, you see trees, you'll treat them another way. And if when you look at this particular tree, you see this particular tree, you treat it differently still. And the same is true, of course, for women, which is one reason I am so completely opposed to pornography, is that if when I look at women, I see orifices, I'll treat them one way. And if when I look at women, I see women, I'll treat them another way. And if I look at this particular woman, I see this particular woman, I'll treat her differently still. How you perceive the world affects how you behave in the world. So a lot of the decolonizing is to change those unquestioned assumptions that are really controlling how you perceive the world and how you act in the world. So that's one part of it. Another part, there's a line I always think of that's a young writer approached Anton Chekhov and said he wanted to write a story and he didn't know what to write. So could Chekhov tell him what to write? And Chekhov said, I want you to write a story about a man who squeezes every drop of slave's blood out of his body. And so that's part of it too, is that we have been trained since infancy to be slaves to the system, to be addicted to the system. The word addict comes from the same root as the word edict, and it means to enslave, because in ancient Rome, a judge would issue an edict that would addict someone to someone else, that would enslave them. And we are enslaved to the system, and we need to squeeze every drop of slave's blood out of ourselves. Another way to look at this is to recognize that, as Robert J. Lifton has written about so well, before you can commit any mass atrocity, you have to convince yourself that what you're doing is not, in fact, an atrocity, but instead a good thing. So the Nazis were not committing genocide and mass murder. They were instead purifying the Aryan race. And the North American settlers were not committing genocide and mass murder and land theft. They were manifesting their destiny. And today, nobody's killing the planet. They are instead developing natural resources. I shared the stage with Ward Churchill one time. Beforehand, we were chatting backstage, and I said, I can't believe how stupid the Nazis were to take such careful records of their atrocities, meticulous records of how much gold they pulled from teeth. And why would they keep such strict records of these terrible actions? And he just looked at me and he said, Derrick, what do you think the GNP is? GNP is a very highly detailed description of the conversion of the living to the dead, of the dismemberment of the living planet. And so part of decolonizing is to recognize that things we think are good, like civilization, like industrialism, like developing natural resources, may in fact be quite terrible and atrocious. And this is absolutely crucial work. And it's crucial work in any case. And one of the things that happens through this process is that, and I think is central to decolonizing, is transferring your loyalty away from the dominant system and toward the land base. And pretty much this is what all my work is about. And then once you transfer your loyalty to the land base, everything else is just technical. What do I do then? But until you do that, your loyalty will still be, by definition, with the dominant culture. So when I do these resistance radio interviews, I ask people, I'm always very clear to them before the interview, you can be as biocentric and ecocentric as you want. That if we're talking about the Mississippi River, or we're talking about the Colorado River, or we're talking about the Columbia River, I don't actually care about agriculture. My loyalty is completely with the river. I don't care if the water stays in the if the water stays in the Colorado River. I don't care that means that cotton growers in Arizona will be driven out of business, or that golf courses in Arizona will go dry, because my loyalty is not with industrial capitalism. My loyalty is with the living planet. And so a lot of that decolonizing is that. How do we do it? Well, we start to question every assumption. And there's a sense in which it's very easy and a sense in which it's very hard. And the sense in which it's very easy is my friend and mentor, John Osborne, helped me understand very early in my environmental work that so many activists, environmental activists, begin by wanting to protect a specific piece of ground, and they end up questioning the foundations of Western civilization. And that's because they'll start to ask questions, and once the questions start, they never stop. So they can ask, why is this land being destroyed? And the answer is usually because somebody's going to make money off of it, for economic production, it's good for the economy. Well, then you ask, why is most land harmed? Well, it's good for the economy. So then you ask, well, have all cultures had economies based on destroying their land base? No. And then you ask, what does it mean that you have an economy based on destroying the land base? And then you ask, what is the end point of having an economy based on destroying the land base? And of course, the answer, that's obvious. You destroy the land base, and you destroy the capacity of life of the earth to support life. And as we see. And so in that sense, decolonizing is really easy. All you have to do is ask one question. It's the same with rape culture. You ask, why was this woman raped? Then you ask, why is any woman raped? Why are so many women raped? Has every culture been a rape culture? And once those questions start, you'll head back to the roots of the problem. In the case of rape, the patriarchal violation imperative. In the case of civilization, civilization's economic arrangements, and also the patriarchal violation imperative. And so in that sense, it's easy. In another sense, it's very hard. And the sense in which it's very hard is that you have to give up on everything that brought meaning before. Or you don't have to give up, but you die is the point. And that's a very scary process. And it can be a very painful process. It's a process that I went through in my 20s, and it's a process that many of us went through in our 20s, where there's this great line by Joseph Campbell. He says it much better than I'm going to say it, but basically, if the signs and symbols of the dominant culture work for you, then there will be a sense of meaning in your life and a sense of accord with the universe. So, for example, if the signs and symbols of Catholicism work for you, then you have a 2,000-year-old path of meaning that's laid out for you. If communion works for you, and gives you a sense of connection, and confession and all the other rituals, if they work for you, or if the American dream works for you and making money brings you meaning, then you have, in that case, a couple 100-year system of meaning set out for you. And I would say that meaning is really perverse, but we'll leave that aside. And Campbell then says, if those signs or symbols don't work for you, then basically you find your life meaningless and you're set adrift. And then you have to go on what he called the hero journey. And I'm sorry for the sexism in the language. That's the journey of that we all have to go through to find meaning in our own lives. That, I mean, life consists of a series of deaths and rebirths. It's pretty extraordinary that, I mean, the central message of the Jesus story is completely missed. It's not that Jesus was a real human being who died and then was resurrected. Instead, it's that for a new part of us to be born, an old part of us has to die. And this is true in any case. When we are in our late teens and early 20s, we have to die as children to be born as adults. That part is left behind and a new part emerges. And that process can be incredibly painful and scary, which is why cultures around the world have had social means by which the young people would be shepherded through that process. And we don't have that. And so there's a sense in which decolonizing can be terribly scary, because we don't really have that many good models for it, and we certainly don't have any social approval for it. Instead, people are pulled back into the culture at every moment. This culture tries to bring us back through television, through books, through whatever means it can, through economically forcing you to stay in the system, making you economically dependent upon the system, and by telling you that you are a consumer and not a citizen or a human animal who needs habitat. It's constantly reinforced. But if you can find another community, a community of people who value living trees over dollars, who value the real world and whose loyalty is with the real world, that can really help this passage. And so decolonizing, the difficult part of it is it involves a very definite death and rebirth, a death of faith that the system will work out, a death of a full internalization of the understanding that the dominant culture hates life and that the dominant culture will kill everything on the planet unless it's stopped. That's what decolonization feels like, is the death of one's loyalty to the system that raised you. I mean, part of the way I think about this all the time is, if space aliens had come down from outer space and they were vacuuming the oceans and they were changing the climate and they were putting dioxins in every mother's breast milk, they were obliterating the planet and giving us computers and tomatoes in January and whatever goodies we want, then I think most of us, if space aliens were doing this, most of us would not have a hard time decolonizing, because we would see it. But after 5 and 10 and 15 generations, people won't see it anymore. And one of the reasons we become so stupid about all this is because from childhood, we pledged allegiance to this culture. And we were taught that this culture is more important than the living planet. And once again, we need to think about this as though it were space aliens who were destroying the planet. Because it doesn't really matter who's destroying the planet. They're destroying the planet and they need to be stopped. And so for me, that process of decolonizing has as its very essence making one's loyalty to the real world.